Democracy is the best system of governance that we've ever devised, simply because when it functions well, it gives a voice to both the hard and the soft virtues. Conservative political parties argue for the right, while liberal political parties argue for the left. The idea, of course, is that after the two sides have duked things out in debating chambers, they'll ultimately balance each other out and shave off each other's more extreme elements. In the UK, this battle comes down to Labour versus Conservative, while in the US it's Democrats versus Republicans, but all Western democracies tend to be divided along this line. Now, the problem with the postmodern era is that because all of culture has now moved to the left, the entire political establishment has also shifted left in a bid to win the popular vote. So, for example, it was the UK's Conservative government who in 2014 legalised gay marriage, not a Labour one, as we might expect. The same Conservative government presided over Christian bakers being prosecuted for refusing to bake gay wedding cakes. They were in office as Christian couples were being refused the chance to adopt children simply for believing in the traditional family unit. They oversaw gender reassignment surgery being offered on the NHS and homosexuality being promoted to children in schools. And of course, every time an Islamic terrorist attack happened in Europe, it was the Conservative prime ministers who would say,
"Islam is a religion of peace."
Islam is a religion of peace.
In fact, to mark their shift to the left, the Conservative Party logo was even changed in 2006 from a torch representing intellectual enlightenment to a softer picture of a cartoon tree drawn by a child. And this worked for them, by the way. In this left pit era where these values are all that counts, this worked for them. They got the votes, they got into power. But since the Conservative Party no longer truly represented conservative values, there was suddenly this big void over here on the right. Suddenly there were no political parties truly speaking up for the hard virtues in the halls of power. Voters were looking at ballot papers and seeing no real difference between any of the options. It began to seem like the entire system was either broken or rigged, like voting made no real difference to the outcome. Whoever you voted for, you would just get liberal policies. Every right-leaning person in the land began to feel a bit disenfranchised and ignored, and this was especially true of the so-called privileged groups whom the left constantly despise and demonise. White heterosexual Christian males, for example.
You're a misogynist pig.
How so?
Because you're a white male.
Feeling that they had no voice in their own country anymore, they were forced to look outside of the traditional political establishment who had abandoned them for new representation. And this is when we began to see the emergence of the alternative right, or the alt-right. In the United Kingdom, the alt-right movement was headed by the UK Independence Party, or UKIP, and its leader, Nigel Farage. And in the United States, the movement was eventually embodied in the emergence of Donald Trump as a presidential candidate in 2016. And the appeal of both of these characters was that they both came from outside of the mainstream political establishment, and they both spoke up for the hard virtues that had been ignored and forgotten for so long in the postmodern age. So truth, righteousness, logic, reason, and justice. Now, because the conservative establishment had moved so far to the left, even they now found the truly conservative policies of Farage and Trump to be too extreme for their tastes. So many within the Republican Party despised Donald Trump and refused to endorse his nomination as their candidate for the 2016 election, while many within the British Conservative Party similarly showed disdain for Nigel Farage. In fact, the Conservative Prime Minister David Cameron dismissed UKIP members like this.
I mean, UKIP, it's just a sort of, bunch of they're just trying to make a bit of mischief. As far as I can see,
there's a bunch of what?
Well, fruitcakes and loonies and closet racists mostly.
Similarly, in the US, when the Islamic terror attack happened in San Bernardino in December 2015, Donald Trump made this statement.
Donald J. Trump is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until our country's representatives can figure out what the hell is going on. According to Pew Research, among others, there is a great hatred toward Americans by large segments of the Muslim population. Most recently, a poll from Center for Security Policy released data showing 25% of those polled agreed that violence against Americans here in the United States is justified as part of the global jihad. And 51% of those polled agreed that Muslims in America should have the choice of being governed according to Sharia. Sharia authorizes such atrocities as murder against non-believers, who won't convert, beheadings, and more unthinkable acts that pose great harm to Americans, especially women. I mean, you look, especially women. It's going to get worse and worse, folks. We can be politically correct and we can be stupid, but it's going to get worse and worse. Until we are able to determine and understand this problem and the dangerous threat it poses, our country cannot be the victim of horrendous attacks by people that believe only in jihad. These are people who only believe in jihad. They don't want our system. They don't want our system. And have no sense of reason or respect for human life.
Now, it wasn't unexpected that Democrats would denounce words like these as racist and bigoted.
You could put half of Trump supporters into what I call the basket of deplorables.
But what disappointed conservatives was that Republicans too were joining in to condemn this kind of plain talking.
What was proposed yesterday is not what this party stands for.
So again, it left many conservatives asking, why is Donald Trump the only one willing to speak the hard truth here? It might hurt some feelings to say what he's saying, but it's undoubtedly true that Islam does have a violence problem. Poll after poll reveals this. A significant number of Muslims do support jihad and Sharia. The Quran and the Hadith support the killing of unbelievers. Attack after attack occurs to the refrain of Allahu Akbar. Why is he the only one willing to say this publicly? Just how many of our innocent civilians have to die in unprovoked terror attacks before we stop pandering and start confronting the reality of this ideology? Why are the political establishment so intent in burying their heads in the sand just to spare some feelings?
Islam is a religion of peace.
Islam is a religion of peace.
Now, the establishment, for their part, just didn't get this. They were stuck in their leftist echo chamber over here, so they failed to understand where the popularity of Donald Trump is actually coming from. In fact, Barack Obama had a vague stab at trying to figure it out. He said,
"The problem is not that all Republicans think the way this guy does. The problem is that they've been riding this tiger for a long time. They've been feeding their base all kinds of crazy for years, primarily for political expedience. All that bile just kind of bubbled up, started surfacing."
In short, he echoed David Cameron's assessment of the alt-right as fruitcakes, loonies and closet racists. Obama thought that Trump happened because Republicans were feeding their base all kinds of crazy bile and it just kind of bubbled up to the surface one day. But he was wrong. The alt-right wasn't created by Republicans feeding their base all kinds of crazy. Liberals created the alt-right by feeding their base all kinds of crazy. The alt-right came in reaction to an entire culture of liberalism that had gone so far left that it became absurd. People looked at men being legally allowed to marry other men, men being given awards for being women, women identifying as babies or cats, men identifying as dogs, and 52-year-old men identifying as 6-year-old girls, and they were exasperated at the sheer stupidity of it.
So I can be a Chinese woman.
You sure.
And they were dismayed that any time they attempted to inject some honest scientific truth into the conversation, they would be hounded and bullied into submission by the liberal herd, possibly even arrested by the police and told they were bigoted and phobic. See, Newton's third law tells us that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. So when the left went ultra-liberal to the point of oppressive lunacy, it caused a whole swathe of society to go ultra-conservative in a desperate attempt to try and bring back some kind of balance. That's why the political divide suddenly seemed wider than ever, because the left went further into their pit, causing the right to go further into theirs. Now, as we've been learning, both ultra-liberalism and ultra-conservatism are bad. We don't want either of them. The far right does contain genuine racism and cold-heartedness, while the far left ends up in communism, thought policing and dehumanizing collectivist repression. We don't want either extreme. But see, the truth is that most people in the alt-right movement are not very extreme at all. They only look extreme to the left because the left are so far away now that they're being ridiculous. In their world, men are women and women are cats and other men are dogs. In fact, anything to the right of Karl Marx is now considered extreme to some of them.
Prefer to live in the Soviet Union?
Hell yeah. Stalin would be a hell of a lot better than Trump.
Stalin would be better than Trump.
Yes, he would.
But the reality again is that most of those in the alt-right movement who voted for Brexit, voted for Trump, are just decent, ordinary individuals who simply believe in truth, righteousness and reason. That's all. They're not fruitcakes, they're not racist, they're just people who, for example, believe in free speech and are fed up of being gagged by the fascism of political correctness. They're people who are tired of being hounded as homophobic for having a different moral stance, or transphobic simply for believing in actual science. They're people who are tired of being vilified for believing in the traditional family unit and the importance of fathers.
Next, the Christian magistrate who was sacked for opposing gay adoption.
They're people who want to be free to follow their conscience without getting a criminal record for it. They're people who want to worship their God and practice their faith in peace without persecution. They're good men who are tired of being told that they're overprivileged and to blame for all of society's ills. They're people who believe that truth, righteousness and reason still matters. That is all. Now, if the left had stayed reasonably moderate and the conservative political establishment had actually stayed on the right and continued to speak for true conservative values, then everyone would have continued about their business and none of this upheaval would have ever happened. It's only when the entire political establishment moved to the far left that alternatives on the right were required, and that's the only reason that the alt-right now exists. So in previous episodes, we saw how the modern era lasted for about 300 years and was defined almost entirely by the hard virtues. When people decided they'd had enough of that, there was a cultural revolution in 1967, the Summer of Love, and that signalled the beginning of a move towards the soft virtues, towards the left pit, and that's when the postmodern era began. And since we know that the end time world will be a left pit world, I speculated that we may just continue down this track now until the days of Noah and Lot emerge and the Antichrist appears and Jesus returns. In other words, the postmodern era could be the last era. But this sudden fight back for conservatism doesn't fit with that narrative. So does Brexit and Trump mean that the postmodern era is already ending after just 50 years and we're now going to culturally go through another revolution that will take us back towards the right for a spell? Or is this just a minor hiccup, a last but ultimately futile effort from conservatives to sort of drag us back in this direction before we continue back down the leftist road? We don't know the answer to that yet, and it's going to be interesting to see how events unfold in the coming years. But what is interesting is that liberals still haven't made their peace with any of the recent events. They're still unable to see the world from outside of their love v hate paradigm. They haven't had any kind of awakening and suddenly realised that actually there might be some good in the conservative paradigm. Maybe we should dialogue and listen to this other side. Maybe it is kind of ridiculous to give men awards for being women and to pretend that women can be cats. I can see how some people might find that a bit ridiculous. Maybe we have been too harsh on men. Maybe solid family units are a good idea. And maybe we shouldn't be shouting bigot and racist at decent people who are clearly neither of those things. And maybe we shouldn't be trying to police the freedom of thought and speech of other people. None of that reconciliation from the left has happened yet. In fact, it seems that recent events have just made them even more determined. Many of them are shouting bigot and hater even louder now and doing everything they can to oppose both Brexit and Trump. There are still protests and marches, and it seems that the deep state is even working against Trump too, trying to frustrate his actions at every turn. If anything, the left is just going even deeper left in response. And what's also interesting is that a lot of this extreme liberalism is coming from the young. Here's a map that shows what would have happened in the 2016 US elections if only 18 to 29-year-olds had voted. As you can see, Trump would have received exactly 0 electoral votes. Hillary Clinton would have won them all. And the same stats come through in the Brexit vote too. The young are super liberal. 75% of the 18 to 24-year-olds voted against Brexit. Now, this isn't entirely surprising. As the old adage goes, if you're not a liberal at 25, you have no heart, but if you're not a conservative by 35, you have no brain. People tend to become more conservative as they grow older. However, if that doesn't happen with this generation, and the leopard ethos of our age keeps everyone liberal right into their old age, then as the current conservative generations die off, the remaining liberals will soon have no resistance and will be able to keep things moving forward towards the days of Noah and Lot at their own speed. But again, that's just all speculation. We don't really know how things are going to go. The only thing that we know is that both extremes are bad. And so this episode shouldn't be taken as a resounding endorsement of Donald Trump either. I do have reservations. And if we don't all calm down and come back into the centre again, if these oscillations between left and right keep getting more and more extreme, then all that will happen is this. This is what's called a speed wobble. The oscillations become ever more violent until it can't go forward anymore and the whole thing comes crashing down. We don't want that. So as Christians, we have to be the voice of reason here and try to stop people from going too extreme. We can bring reconciliation because we uniquely understand through the Bible and God's character that both love and truth do matter. It's only as we model that to the world, as we speak the truth in love, that each side might be saved from themselves.